Hey, I'm Daniel and welcome back to another Elder Scrolls Betrayal of the Second Era video. And today we're doing a skill line breakdown. I'll explain how it works, highlight some common rules mistakes, and share some tips based on official clarification, community knowledge, and my own playtime. Let's go! Alright, so let's talk about the Daedric Summoning skill line today. It belongs to the Mage Constellation, as you can tell by this little blue icon at the bottom of the reference sheet, which is important detail for town trainers and certain game effects. This skill line is also associated with Magicka, which limits the number of dice you can roll in a single engage up to your Magicka stat, and it also requires Magic Battle Form to perform an engage. So the first level 1 skill die is called Daedric Curse. On one side it deals X true damage to an adjacent enemy, and on the other face it deals 1 true damage to an adjacent enemy, and then any single adventure may trigger one of their class abilities that costs 2 tenacity or less for free. And oh boys, there is a lot to unwrap here, so let's go one by one. First of all, it deals damage to an adjacent enemy, and there is no mention of a target, and that means you can deal that damage to an enemy, an adjacent enemy more specifically, even while you targeting another enemy. And just to give you a quick example, let's say we have this another enemy, Argonian Bandit, a couple of hexes away, and let's say this Argonian Bandit is standing adjacent to us. Let's say you declare this Argonian Bandit as your target and you want to roll this Force Shock die from the Distraction Stuff skill line alongside Daedric Curse. Because both of these skill lines, they require to be in Magic Battle Form, it means that you can roll them together in a single engage, of course provided that you have enough Magicka stat to accommodate that number of roll dice together, but in this case we can do that, and you can deal this damage to Argonian Bandit while still being able to deal damage with Daedric Curse to adjacent enemy, because this is not a target of this engage. And of course this is just a basic little detail, but I know that sometimes it's overlooked, so I thought it would be worth mentioning this as well. Next, remember that this ability deals true damage, which means it ignores enemy defense. So for example, if this Daedric Curse rolled on this side with a number 1, means it deals 1 true damage, which means this Orc Bandit would lose 1 health as the result of this engage, despite having 1 shield, 1 defense. And of course you can roll potentially up to 2 true damage, and there are even 2 sides that would deal 2 damage, so it's a pretty decent chance for rolling this result and dealing 2 true damage, which definitely puts this die kinda above the power level curve compared to other level 1 skill dice. But of course there is also another side of this die, which is this one, which says it deals 1 true damage to an adjacent enemy, just like on this one, but after that it says then any single adventure may trigger one of their class abilities that costs 2 tenacity or less for free. Now a small detail that maybe isn't very obvious, but there are some dice that reduce the cost of your class abilities, and of course specifically I'm referring to this Windwalker die that can reduce the cost of your class abilities by up to 2. And so let's say if we have a look at the Sorcerer class sheet, and maybe let's take a look at this Blood Magic ability, which normally costs 4 tenacity, but if you have this Windwalker in your cooldown track with this particular result, which means your Blood Magic ability would cost 2 tenacity instead of 4, and therefore you can trigger it essentially for free using this Daedric Curse, because it allows you to trigger ability that costs 2 tenacity or less for free. And so for this reason I would say that Daedric Summoning and Windwalker is such a nice combo, because it allows you to trigger so many more class abilities for free essentially because of this discount. However, keep in mind that some class abilities, they ask you to spend additional amount of tenacity, for example like Sorcerer Power Surge, or like Healer's Rationer, or like Acrobat's Arcane Alacrity, or Dragon Knight Dragon Leap. For all of those abilities, it says that you may spend a different additional amount of tenacity, and just keep in mind that this additional tenacity would not be included in triggering this ability. In other words, if you choose some of those abilities with your Daedric Curse, you can essentially activate them for free, so you can get just this 1 tenacity effect for free, but if you would want to spend any additional amount of tenacity, you would need to actually spend it. This doesn't count as the cost of the ability itself. But there's only one ability that can a little bit exception to that, and that is Spell Sword's Hero's Vigor, because its tenacity cost is X rather than 1. Because this ability says that you can recover 1 drained die, and the tenacity cost of this ability is equal to the level of the recovered die. So this X is essentially like a variable, it's a different amount depending on the dice that you're trying to recover, and in that case this variable cost, it does kinda built in the cost of the ability itself, and therefore it will trigger by Daedric Curse. So I hope it makes sense. And there is also another thing you need to know about this die, specifically this phase, because it says the wording, the structure kinda says that you first deal damage and then you can trigger class abilities. And the question you might have is whether it's okay to trigger just the latest part, the second part of triggering the ability without dealing damage. Let's say if you don't have an adjacent unit, an adjacent enemy to deal damage to, can you trigger this ability? And while previously in the previous iteration of the ruling, it was indeed allowed to use that, even if you don't have any adjacent enemy to deal damage to with the first part of this ability, you could essentially skip that and resolve only the second second part, which says that then any adventurer may trigger their class ability. But with the latest iteration of these rules, which was updated just yesterday by Cheap Theory Games on their Discord channel, now the first part with the ability to deal damage is considered the cost of this effect, and you need to resolve it in order to trigger the second part of this die. So that means that you have to deal damage with the first part, which means that you need to have an adjacent unit to deal damage to, and only then you can resolve the second part by triggering a class ability. And this of course not exclusive to this Daedric Curse, it applies to all skill dice that have a similar wording structure, where they do something, do X, and then do something. So now you need to resolve the first part if you want to trigger the second part as well. Now let's take a look at the next level 1 skill dice called Bound Armaments. On the one face it says at the end of any unit's turn, you may choose an adventurer in light weapon, heavy weapon or ranged battle form to perform an engage, rolling 3 enemy combat dice. This engage ignores enemy skill Ethereal, then exhaust this die. And on the other face it says at the end of any unit's turn, you may choose an adventurer in light weapon, heavy weapon or ranged battle form to perform an engage, rolling 2 of their available skill dice. If those dice would be exhausted, they are recovered instead, then exhaust this die. And again, there is quite a lot to unwrap here, so let's go one bit at a time. First of all, it's an active die, as you can tell by this little green icon with the letter A inside, which means after rolling the die and you're resolving it, you need to place it in your active slots like that. Now, while you have this die in your active slot, you may trigger its effect at the specified timing, which says in this case at the end of any unit's turn. And just a quick reminder that the word unit includes all characters, whether it's be adventurers or enemies or companions, just pretty much any figures, enemy or allies presently in the game, in battle. And also keep in mind that end of turn is a very specific turn phase, as you can tell here by this adventure turn reference breakdown. End of turn is a specific phase that happens at the end of all other actions, which kind of makes sense. So you roll this die, you place this in your active slot, now you know when to trigger this effect, which is at the end of any unit's turn, and how you can trigger its effect, which depends on the side of this die. So let's talk about this one first, which says that you need to choose an adventurer in kind of physical battle forms, in heavy weapon, light weapon or ranged, to perform an engage, rolling 3 enemy combat dice. So this battle form is a little caveat of this skill, because remember that in order to roll any dice from the Daedric Summoning skill line, you need to be in magic battle form, but the skill says that you need to select an adventurer in not magic battle form essentially. So that means that if you want to use this on yourself after you've done all of your adventurer actions, whether it's engage or movement or exploration, and if you want to use this effect on yourself, then actually before ending your turn, before going to the end of turn phase, you would need to switch to either of those battle forms, and of course you can do that by making another engage and gaining a required amount of light fatigue, which is 1 on easy or normal difficulties and 2 light fatigue on the expert difficulty. And so let's say you paid the cost, you switch to battle form, let's say to heavy weapon, and now you can trigger this effect, which means you can select yourself to perform essentially a free engage by rolling 3 combat die against a targetable enemy. And of course remember that all the normal targeting restrictions still apply, so let's say if you choose to switch to heavy weapon battle form but you would have no adjacent enemies around you, then that means you wouldn't be able to roll any dice, because you still need to have a target. But let's say you do have an enemy on the adjacent hex, which means you can make an engage in this case, so you would roll the die and resolve them as normal, and then you would exhaust this bound armaments to the cooldown track. Now on the other face of this die, it's this one. Instead of rolling 3 enemy combat dice, you would roll 2 available skill dice. And remember that available, it means that sitting in your attribute rows, ready for rolling, so it means it's not in a cooldown track, not in the active slots, and not drained, which is outside of your character mat. So with this face of the die, with all restrictions still being the same, which means you would need to choose an adventurer in all of those 3 battle forms, but then you would roll 2 of your available skill dice, which in this case, for example, we can roll 2 of our combat dice, resolving them and dealing damage as normal, but then instead of placing those dice to the cooldown track as normal, part of the resolving these dice, you recover them instead, so they become available for the next turn again. And of course this die will get exhausted. So in a nutshell, the difference between two faces of this die is on this one you deal 3 enemy combat die, you can resolve them and you then return those dice to the supply, and on this side you roll 2 of your available skill dice, you resolve them as normal, but then you recover them instantly, placing them back to the attribute rows, and of course in both of the cases you would then exhaust this die. So this skill die, Bound Armament, is essentially almost like a buff. It's at least one of the ways of thinking about this. You can grant in either yourself or another adventurer an extra engage, so that is kind of another way of dealing damage, but I would say in not direct way, which definitely makes this skill die quite interesting and rather unique. Moving on to the level 2, the first die we have is called Power Stone, which says that you may change the result of up to 2 other skill dice you roll this engage to a side of your choice. So just to explain how it works, let's say you roll this Power Stone alongside side maybe Daedric Curse, and Daedric Curse landed on a miss. But because you have Power Stone landed with number 1, which means you can change the other skill dice you roll disengage. That means in this case it's a one other die to the side of your choice. So for example, you can choose this side or maybe this one. If you want to deal 2-3 damage, it's up to you. Maybe sometimes you even want to have it actually land on a miss so you could gain tenacity. Again, it's completely up to you, but this is exactly what makes it so powerful. And of course, if you have your Power Stone landed on this side, that with the number 2, it means you can change the result of up to 2 dice you roll disengage. So let's say if you have both of your Daedric Curse and maybe Bound Armament landed on misses and you would rather prefer to change them to something else, you can do that. For example, you can change this one to this side and this one maybe to this one. It's completely again up to you. You have full control on how do you want to resolve this dice and on what side. And of course, because it says that you may change the result of dice that you roll this engage, and during the engage you may roll different dice from different skill lines. For example, maybe instead of those 2 dice from the Daedric Summoning skill line, you would roll those 2 from the Destruction Staff skill line, and maybe you would want, instead of this result of Power Force Shock, you would want to have maybe this side, and maybe for the Destructive Touch you would want this side, something like that. Again, it's up to you. As long as you roll those dice together and as long as you have this number, this result on Power Stone, you can adjust other dice that's rolled. And of course, you would absolutely need to be in Magic Battle form. I just kept this one from the previous example of Bound Armament, so make sure you actually roll in all of those in Magic Battle form. And I think there is one more thing that is probably not somewhat obvious, especially for beginner players, but if you have a look at all skill lines from the Thief Constellation, which are currently include Acrobatics and Legerdemain and Shadow and Speech, they don't require any particular battle forms, which means you can roll all of those dice even in Magic Battle form alongside your Power Stone. And on practice, it means that maybe if you want to, you can roll these dice together, all while still being in Magic Battle form, and because you have your Power Stone, you can still adjust the result even of those non-magic dice. Let's say you can adjust the Windwalker to the number 2, or maybe you want to adjust the Authority and change this to number 5. Again, it's completely up to you. As long as you have this result and as long as you roll this die together, you can do that. Moving on to the second level 2 skill die of the skill line, we have Expert Summoner, which says the combat stat and movement of companion you control are increased by X. After one of these companions engages, reduce this die by 1. If this die would be reduced to 0, exhaust it. So first of all, it's another active die, as you can tell by this little green icon alongside the letter A inside it, which means when you roll it and you resolve it, you place this in your active slot and it sits there until the end of battle cleanup. Now, since this die affects companions, let's say we have this Clan Fear as our companion on adjacent hex, and while you have this Expert Summoner sitting in your active slot, specifically here with the number 3, it means the movement and combat of your companion is increased by this number, which is 3 in this case. So normally all companions have 2 movements, but with this one, with the number 3 specifically, they can move up to 5 hexes, and after each time they move, this value doesn't change here. But after your companion engages, only after that you reduce this die by 1. So it becomes 3, then it becomes 1, then it becomes 0, and exhausts like that to your cooldown track as normal. And so let's say we have this Expert Summoner again with the number 3 sitting in your active slot, and this particular companion, Clan Fear, it has 2 combat, so that means that 2 plus 3 for the next engage, it would have 5 combat in total, and that means it would roll all those 5 enemy combat dice like that. And of course, after engage, this die was reduced by 1, so for the next engage, it will have only 4 combat, which means they would roll 4 combat dice, and then of course it will be reduced again by 1, so it's now 1, which means 3 in total combined with those 2, and then down to 0, and now it's back to this original value of just 2 combat and 2 movement. So for this die, I would say there is nothing particularly special about the rules or nuances. That's pretty much how it works. You resolve it, you place this in your active slot, and that's how much movement and combat you add to your companions, and then you reduce it by 1 after each engage. Maybe probably the only kind of caveat that is maybe somewhat not very obvious, but after each engage you must reduce this die by 1, and of course you must increase all those stats by the respective number. So it's not something you can skip, it's not an optional thing. If you want to skip this effect for whatever reason, you can just voluntarily exhaust this die right away. Remember, they can do that. You can do this at any time for any of your active dice. Moving on to the level 3, we have a Summon. Deploy a companion unit to an unoccupied adjacent hex. This companion is controlled by you, and this companion is removed at the end of battle. First of all, this skill die is drained, as you can tell by this little D icon in the red circle. That means that after you roll in this and resolving it, it goes off your adventure mat, which means it doesn't place it in the cooldown track, which essentially means it's just a one-off effect, just once per battle, essentially, of course, unless you have a way of recovering dice back to your adventure mat. And so the 2 companions that you can potentially deploy are Clan Fear and Atronach, depending on the result of this die, but the caveat is that both of those companions, they are on the same chip on different sides, so that means you cannot summon both of them. It has to be either this one, Atronach, if you roll on this side, or if you roll this particular side, that you get your Clanfear companion like that. And of course you may notice that there are 2 of these dice in the supply, so you can potentially train them both, but remember that because this companion is still limited by a single chip, you still cannot summon both of them even if you train both of these skill dice. That being said, of course you can still resolve them one at a time. Let's say you have summon dice trained and maybe you first roll this one to summon this companion, but then this companion is yet defeated, so it's no longer here, it is removed. Then you can of course roll this again and summon maybe the same companion or another companion depending on the roll. It's gonna be something like that. So let's take a look at the companions themselves. On the one side, it's this one, we have Atronach, which is kinda tanky and beefy companion because it has 6 health and also divert, which means it cannot be one-shotted, and with a combination with a 1 defense and 6 health, I would say it's a pretty beefy one. But with that in mind, it has only 1 combat and 1 range, and it also targets only a single unit, so this is definitely not the strongest companion when it comes to damage output. On the flip side, we have Clanfear, which is another companion that you can summon with this particular phase of this die. It has only 3 health, so it's definitely not as tanky, and it doesn't have this divert skill anymore, but it has aggressive, it has range 3, and it has 2 combat. And personally, I always prefer to summon Clanfear instead of Atronach. I think this combination of 3 range and 2 combat and aggressive makes it very strong companion as a damage dealer. And of course remember that you can always choose not to resolve certain dice. Let's say you don't have this companion yet and you roll just a single this summon die, and maybe it landed on this particular side, but you don't want to summon Atronach because otherwise this die would be drained, and that's it. Well, in that moment you can choose not to resolve this die entirely and just place this in your cooldown track. Of course not summoning, not resolving the ability, but then next time you would recover this die and you would have another chance to roll in this again. And finally, on to level 4, we have the last skill die called Tempered Soul. Select any level 1 or 5 enemy from the defeated stack, deploy it with full health to an unoccupied adjacent hex. This unit is now companion controlled by you, and this companion is removed at the end of battle. So just like the summon, this Tempered Soul is also a drain die, which means it's a one-off effect once per battle, of course unless you have a way of recovering this die using certain abilities. And remember that when you defeat an enemy, they don't normally return to the drawback, they are placed in a separate stack called defeated stack next to your clash. And while those enemies are here in your defeated stack, you can choose any level 1 or 5 enemies from this stack to deploy them with full health as your companions. Now of course keep in mind that it has to be the same exact enemy with the same level. So for example, if you have this Orc Bandit and you roll this Tempered Soul, you cannot flip this Orc Bandit to another of its level 5 side. It has to be exactly the same enemy as it was defeated. So since in this case it was Orc Bandit, we can essentially resurrect only this particular Orc Bandit, but not Orc Marauder. Now the question you might have, and I certainly had, and frankly I just recently actually learned how to play this correctly, but let's say you roll this Tempered Soul and maybe alongside a Daedric Curse, maybe on this side, and maybe something from the destructive stuff skill line, maybe this Force Shock dice. And so the question is, if you defeat this enemy in the single engage and it plays in a defeated stack, can you resurrect it and use this Tempered Soul right away? Or does this has to be in a separate engage? So let's say you defeat this enemy first with those 2 dice, then this enemy is defeated, placed in the defeated stack, and maybe on the next engage you roll this Tempered Soul. Or can you roll this all together and essentially resolve all of those effects, including defeating enemy and resurrecting it with Tempered Soul in a single engage? Or maybe if we phrase this question a bit differently, what would be the appropriate and correct timing of moving the enemy from the battlefield to the defeated stack? And well, long story short, you can actually defeat enemy and then resurrect it with Tempered Soul in a single engage, because as soon as you resolve those dice that deal damage pulled together, and as soon as the enemy has last health chip removed, it's placed in the defeated stack right away, which means you can turn this in a companion with your Tempered Soul right away in a single engage. We've got official clarification from Chip 3 Games team about resolving this die just a day ago, at least at the time of recording this video, so now it's perfectly clear and official. So what's my final thoughts about this skill line and what I personally think about it? And to be honest, I think Daedric Summoning is one of the strongest skill lines in the game. It not necessarily deals a lot of damage on its own, but the utility it provides is just massive. I think starting with Daedric Curse, it's a very underappreciated die, because not only dealing true damage is great, but most importantly for triggering class abilities that that costs 2 tenacity or less for free is just massive, especially if you combine this with Windwalker. You can essentially trigger an ability that costs up to 4 tenacity for free, which is just very strong. Now, Bound Armaments is a little bit tricky die. I think it's sometimes a little bit tricky, in particular when you're playing in true solo, because you need to switch battle forms in order to use it, and especially that on this side you need to roll available skill dice, and by the time it's at the end of your turn, it's most likely you already used most of your skill dice, so I would say it might be a little bit tricky choice for solo players, but I think this die is amazing as a supporting role if you're playing with multiple adventurers. Now, Power Stone, I think, is just purely one of the strongest, if not the strongest die in the game, because it's a game when you're rolling the die, you never know what you get. There's always chance of misses or maybe landing on the side that you don't want to resolve, but with this one you have 100% control of your result, of course provided that this die itself doesn't miss. So as long as your Power Stone landed on at least one, but ideally of course with the number 2, you can do just so many things. You can of course adjust the Windwalker or maybe other skill dice from the acrobatic skill line, maybe Expert Evasion or maybe even Expert Summoner. You can change it to the number 3 as well, because otherwise it's sometimes a bit tricky to land it specifically on the number 3 because it's only one of the 6 faces, so this is another consideration. Or maybe even from other skill lines, for example, you can change their number of Elemental Rage from 5 up to 7, which is also the maximum damage you can have from this die. There are plenty of other dice, and just being able to choose the side that you want is just so massive. I absolutely love this die, and I'm trying to squeeze this in pretty much all of my Magicka builds simply because it's so good. I think Expert Summoner is pretty much a no-brainer for any companion build, whether you're playing a Necromancer or a Warden or just any class or any builds that has some companions. This die essentially doubles or sometimes even triples the outcome of your companions because you just add so many combat dice to your rolls. Now, for the summon skill, I think this particular phase of summoning Atranak is slightly underwhelming, at least personally for me. Whenever I see this side, I either just choosing not to resolve this effect and just placing this in my cooldown track straight away, or sometimes I'm rolling this alongside Power Stone to make sure that I land on this side, because yeah, I think this particular summon, Clan Fear, is just much stronger. I think its aggressive trait is really underappreciated, but it deals so much damage, especially if you have your Expert Summoner, which means it's gonna roll 5 enemy combat dice, and when you're rolling that many enemy combat dice, there is just nothing worse than seeing all of those blanks, all of those misses on this dice. But with the aggressive trait, you can reroll it to hopefully deal more damage. So yeah, I think this is really good. And I think Tempered Soul is very strong as well, because there are just so many level 5 specific enemies that are just very powerful. Some of them rolling 2 or sometimes 3 combat dice. Some of them have 2 defense, for example, like this Orc Marauder. It's also aggressive and it can target 2 units, so this is really strong. And of course your Expert Summoner still works even on those companions that you summoned with this Tempered Soul, so there's just a lot of internal synergy going on in this skill line, but it's great to fit this some certain dice to other builds and other skill lines and combine them together. Yeah, I think just Daedric Summoning is absolutely awesome. It's so thematic and it's so strong and it's so universally good for so many different variations and builds, and just there's a lot of little things you can slot in. For example, even if you're going full on the supportive build, you can train 2 copies of Bound Armaments, although even sometimes it's great even if when you're playing solo, if you're going for a little bit more exotic kind of hybrid variations. And of course Power Stone is just good for whatever build you're playing. It's just awesome. And Daedric Curse is especially great for triggering your class abilities that costs up to 4 tenacity with this particular combo with Windwalker. So if you're playing some classes that have very awesome, very powerful class abilities, this is the way to go. And of course if you enjoy commanding the hordes of enemies, yeah, then Summoning and Tempered Soul together, this is just another awesome abilities. I'm a huge fan of Daedric Summoning, and I think it's very fun. And that's it for this breakdown. If you found it helpful, feel free to give it a like and subscribe. This really helps the channel grow. And if you would like to support what I'm doing more directly, you can do this over on Patreon, and I would appreciate this a lot as well. And well, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.